The scent of lilies and damp earth usually brought Ava Smith peace, but today, the air turned cold. The tiny bell above the door chimed, not with the gentle ring of a local customer, but with a sharp, demanding tone. Shadowy figures in tailored charcoal suits fanned out, flanking the entrance like wolves in a garden. Then, he stepped in. Lee Min-ho, the alpha male whose name was whispered in fear across Seoul, the man she had served as a black maid for years, and the man whose bed she had fled 6 months ago. The status contrast was blinding. His $10,000 watch gleamed against the backdrop of her chipped wooden counters. Ava's breath hitched as she reflexively moved behind a tall arrangement of sunflowers, her hand instinctively shielding her 6-month hidden pregnancy. His dark eyes, once filled with a terrifying forbidden love, locked onto hers with a predator's focus. He didn't look at the flowers. He looked at her pale face, then trailed his gaze down to the unmistakable curve of her belly. This was the shocking encounter she had prayed would never happen. The Mafia boss had found his secret baby, and the silence in the shop was the sound of her old life shattering. Before we get into this shocking encounter, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss our daily AMBW dark romance stories. Now, let's find out what happens when a secret is finally exposed. The chime of the bell still echoed in the small shop, but the sound that followed was much more chilling. The heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding into place. Lee Min-ho didn't take his eyes off Ava as he reached behind him, his gloved hand moving with a terrifying, practiced calmness to lock the world out. The flowery scent of jasmine and lilies that usually filled Ava's lungs now felt like it was suffocating her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that she feared he could hear across the narrow counter. This unexpected reunion was the nightmare she had played out in her mind every night for 6 months, but the reality was far more suffocating. Min-ho stepped forward, his polished Italian leather shoes clicking against the worn wooden floorboards. The status contrast was an open wound in the room. He looked like a god of cold metal and dark silk standing in her humble sanctuary. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. The sheer weight of his presence was a physical pressure, the hallmark of an alpha mafia boss who took up all the oxygen in the room. 6 months, Ava, he murmured, his voice a low, melodic silk that made her skin crawl with old memories of their forbidden love. 6 months of searching every corner of the globe for a black maid who thought she could simply disappear. Ava backed away until the edge of the potting table pressed into her spine. She tried to keep her posture straight, but her hand betrayed her, trembling as it hovered near her stomach. She saw his eyes drop, tracking the movement. His gaze sharpened, turning from cold to predatory as he processed the curve she couldn't quite hide behind the counter. The dark romance that had once defined their secret nights in the manor now felt like a shroud. "Is this why you ran?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, thick with a dangerous newfound obsession. He closed the distance until he was towering over her, his expensive cologne masking the scent of the roses. He reached out, not to touch her face, but to place a possessive hand on the counter, pinning her in place. "You thought you could keep a hidden pregnancy from me? You thought you could keep my heir in a place like this?" The mafia romance she had tried to escape was dragging her back down into the depths. Ava looked up, her underdog resilience flickering in her eyes despite her fear. "I didn't think, Min-ho. I knew. I knew what your world would do to a child." His jaw tightened, a flash of pure alpha male fury crossing his handsome features before it settled into something much more permanent, total possession. He wasn't just here to talk. The mafia boss discovers secret stakes were now absolute. He leaned in closer, his lips inches from her ear. "You made a mistake, Ava. You forgot that everything you have, including the life growing inside you, belongs to me." Min-ho didn't move to grab her. He didn't have to. Instead, he began to pace the narrow perimeter of the shop like a panther measuring the dimensions of a new cage. He trailed a gloved finger over the petals of a delicate white orchid, his lip curling in a silent, disparaging judgment. The status contrast was stifling. To Ava, these flowers were her life's work and her sanctuary. To the billionaire mafia boss, they were fragile, worthless things that withered in a week. He picked up a small, hand-painted ceramic vase from the shelf, turning it over with a look of mock curiosity before setting it back down with a thud that made Ava flinch. "Is this what you traded a palace for, Ava? Selling weeds to locals for pocket change?" His voice was laced with a cruel amusement that cut deeper than an open threat. He shadowed her every move, his tall, imposing frame casting a long, dark silhouette over the bright sunflowers as she tried to busily rearrange a display just to keep her hands from shaking. He was everywhere. The scent of his sandalwood cologne clashing with the gardenias, the sound of his breathing a constant reminder that her peace was an illusion. He was mocking her simple life, making sure she felt the crushing weight of his wealth against her struggle to survive. He stopped directly behind her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his charcoal suit. "You live in a room above a shop that doesn't even have a proper security system. You eat at a wooden table that costs less than my shoes." He leaned over her shoulder, his gaze dropping significantly to the protective way she held her elbows tucked against her ribs. "And yet, you carry a secret baby in these conditions, a child that deserves an empire, not this." Ava spun around, her face flushed, with a mix of fear and defiance. The underdog resilience he had always found so frustratingly attractive flared in her eyes. "This simple life is mine, Minho. It's honest, it's quiet, and it has nothing to do with you." His eyes darkened, the dark romance obsession in his gaze intensifying until it felt like a physical weight. "Nothing to do with me," he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. He stepped into her personal space, forcing her to look up at him. "Do not lie to me. Tell me who the father is." "He's a man you'll never meet," her voice trembling but firm. "A man who is nothing like you." The air in the shop seemed to freeze. Minho's hand shot out, gripping the edge of the counter beside her hip, his knuckles white. The denial didn't drive him away, it only fueled his obsession. He didn't believe her for a second. This shocking encounter was only the beginning. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, his eyes burning with the fire of a man who was used to owning everything he touched. The silence in the flower shop stretched thin, but in the depths of Minho's dark eyes, Ava didn't see the present, she saw the ghost of the manner and soul. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow, transporting her back to the rain-slicked nights where the status contrast between a black maid and a king was supposed to be an uncrossable line. In that world, she had been a shadow moving through his marble halls, polishing surfaces that reflected his cold, lonely life. But the shadows had a way of merging. She remembered the first time the Mafia boss had truly looked at her. It wasn't across a boardroom or a battlefield, but in the dim light of his private library at 3 a.m. He had been bleeding, a jagged cut across his palm from a deal gone sour, and she had been the only one brave enough to approach him without being summoned. She hadn't bowed, she had simply taken his hand. That night, the alpha male had lowered his guard, allowing her to dress the wound while the rest of the world trembled at his feet. It was the birth of a forbidden love, a dangerous tether between the man who owned everything and the woman who owned nothing but her dignity. Those secret months were a blur of stolen moments and heated whispers behind heavy mahogany doors. Minho had become obsessed even then, finding excuses to have her in his study, watching her move with a quiet grace that grounded his chaotic soul. He had started bringing her rare orchids, the very flowers she now grew in her shop, as if trying to buy her soul before he even realized he had lost his own. Their past lovers' reunion now felt like a cruel joke, a haunting echo of the nights he had promised to protect her, only for his world to eventually become the very thing she had to flee. The memory of his touch back then, gentle, almost reverent, clashed violently with the cold, possessive man standing before her now. In the manor, he was her secret. Here, he was her hunter. He had let her in just enough to see the man beneath the monster, and that's why his current obsession was so terrifying. He knew her heart because she had held his in her hands while she cleaned the blood from his skin. Ava blinked, the bright colors of her flower shop rushing back to replace the cold marble of Korea. Min-ho was still staring at her, his expression unreadable, but his gaze fixed on her lips, as if he were remembering the same forbidden heat. He wasn't just looking for a secret baby, he was looking for the only woman who had ever seen him as a human being. The tension in the room was no longer just about anger. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of a second-chance romance that neither of them knew how to survive. The fragile piece of the flower shop didn't just break, it shattered. Outside, the screech of tires on pavement acted as a violent wake-up call, snapping the tension between Ava and Min-ho. Through the glass storefront, two black SUVs veered sharply to the curb, fanning out to block the exit. The men who spilled out didn't wear the refined, tailored suits of Min-ho's personal guard. They carried the cold, aggressive energy of a rival syndicate that had been hunting for a weakness in the alpha mafia boss for months. "Get down," Min-ho commanded, his voice shifting instantly from a low, obsessive drawl to the sharp, lethal tone of a man born for war. Ava didn't hesitate. Her underdog instinct for survival took over as she scrambled behind the heavy oak counter, her hands once again instinctively shielding her hidden pregnancy. The status contrast was now a matter of life and death. Her world of soft petals and morning dew was being swallowed by the high-stakes violence that followed Min-ho like a shadow. This was exactly why she had fled, because the alpha male didn't just bring power, he brought a target. The front window exploded inward as a heavy object crashed through the glass, raining shards over the delicate orchids. The rival gang had spotted his cars, and they knew he was here. They had followed the trail of his obsession, and now Ava was no longer just a secret. She was a tactical liability. In this mafia romance, love was a luxury, but a secret baby was a death sentence if it fell into the wrong hands. If his enemies realized she was carrying his heir, the leverage they would have over the most powerful man in Seoul would be absolute. "Min-ho, please," Ava whispered, her voice trembling as she tucked herself into the smallest possible space. He looked back at her for a split second, and for the first time since he walked into the shop, the coldness in his eyes was replaced by a raw, protective fire. He had to make a choice. His pride demanded he stay and slaughter every man outside to prove his dominance, but his heart, the part of him that only Ava could touch, demanded her safety. This shocking encounter had quickly turned into a romantic thriller story. He stood his ground in the center of the shop, a silhouette of death amidst the scattered roses, and signaled his men. "Clear the back exit," he snapped into his radio. He chose her. He moved toward her, his body acting as a human shield against the chaos outside. As the first gunshot echoed through the small town, Ava realized that the mafia boss was no longer just her hunter. He was her only hope for survival. The roar of the engines drowned out Ava's protests as the armored motorcade tore away from the shattered remains of her flower shop. Within hours, the small-town air was replaced by the sterile, pressurized atmosphere of a private jet, and then, finally, the suffocating luxury of a glass-walled penthouse overlooking the city. Min-ho didn't ask for her permission. In his world, his protection was a command, not a choice. He had effectively kidnapped her under the guise of safety, claiming that his enemies would never stop hunting the woman carrying his secret baby. As the heavy steel doors of the penthouse hissed shut, the status contrast returned with a vengeance. Ava stood in the center of the vast, marble-floored living room, still wearing her dirt-stained sneakers and a floral apron dusted with glass from the explosion. She looked like a smudge of ink on a pristine white canvas. Min-ho stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his dark suit perfectly pressed, his silhouette radiating the absolute power of a mafia boss who had reclaimed his most prized possession. "The shop is gone, Ava. This is your reality now," he said, his voice cold and final. He gestured to a set of shopping bags filled with designer labels and a shimmering silk robe laid out on a velvet chaise. With trembling hands, Ava eventually traded her humble clothes for the heavy, expensive silk. The fabric felt like a cold weight against her skin, a reminder that she was once again a black maid who had been elevated to a golden prisoner. As she looked at her reflection, the hidden pregnancy was now impossible to ignore beneath the high-end fabric. She was no longer the independent woman who had built a life from nothing. She was back in the gilded cage of a dark romance, where her every move was watched by cameras and silent guards. Min-ho entered the room, his alpha male presence filling the space until the air felt thin. He didn't stay by the door. He walked directly to her, his gaze fixated on her stomach with a terrifying mixture of pride and possessiveness. The penthouse was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of medical equipment that felt alien in the cold, modern bedroom. Ava lay still on the bed, her fingers gripping the edge of a silk sheet as a private Mafia doctor, a man who had spent his career stitching up bullet wounds, moved a cold transducer over her stomach. Min-ho stood at the foot of the bed, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of iron. The status contrast was palpable. He was a man who commanded legions, yet he stood powerless against the biological reality of the life he had forced back into his world. "The heart rate is stable, but the stress levels are critical," the doctor murmured, his voice low and professional. "This hidden pregnancy has taken a toll, Min-ho. If the mother's blood pressure doesn't drop, the baby's growth will suffer. She needs peace, not a fortress." The words hit the room like a physical blow. For the first time, the alpha mafia boss flinched. His obsession had driven him to hunt her down and lock her away, but he was now realizing that his very presence was the source of the danger. The emotional romance drama reached a fever pitch as the doctor turned the monitor toward the bed. A grainy black and white image appeared, a flickering pulse, a tiny curled shape that represented the future of a legacy. Min-ho's breath caught. He stepped closer, his cold exterior finally cracking as he saw his secret baby for the very first time. The hunter, who had spent 6 months scouring the globe for a runaway black maid, vanished, replaced by a man staring at a miracle he didn't know how to deserve. His hand, usually wrapped around the grip of a weapon, moved instinctively toward the screen, his fingers trembling. "Is that him?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, stripped of its usual authority. "Or her," Ava corrected softly, her voice thick with unshed tears. In that moment, the tension in the room shifted. The mafia romance wasn't just about possession anymore. It was about a life that was half his and half hers. Min-ho looked from the screen to Ava's tired, beautiful face. The weight of his choices settled heavily on his shoulders. He had treated her like a prize to be recaptured, but seeing the vulnerability of his heir made him realize that being a protector meant more than just iron doors and armed guards. It meant protecting her heart, too. This shocking encounter with his own fatherhood was the first time the billionaire boss felt truly humbled, realizing that his wealth could buy a penthouse, but it couldn't buy the safety of the tiny heartbeat on the screen. The days in the penthouse stretched into a gilded blur of silence and tension. Min-ho, usually a man of calculated action, seemed haunted by the flickering image of the ultrasound. To him, every problem had a price, and he attempted to bridge the chasm between them the only way he knew how, with excess. He flooded the suite with tribute, from rare lilies that reminded her of her lost shop to velvet boxes containing diamonds that caught the morning light like shards of ice. It was the ultimate display of status contrast. He offered her a queen's ransom, while she sat in her silk robes, mourning the simple life of a florist. "These won't fix what you broke, Min-ho," Ava said one evening, sliding a diamond necklace across the marble table as if it were common glass. The dark romance that had once bound them was now a cage of luxury. She looked at him, not with the fear of a former black maid, but with the weary eyes of a woman who had seen the bottom of his soul. "You're trying to buy a second-chance romance with stones. You think if the glitter is bright enough, I'll forget why I ran?" Min-ho paused, his hand gripping a crystal glass of whiskey. The alpha male arrogance that usually shielded him was frayed. "I am giving you the world, Ava. I am giving our child an empire. Most women would kill for this." "Most women haven't seen the blood on the floor of your library," she countered, her voice low and steady. This was the heart of their forbidden love, the irreconcilable difference between his power and her peace. "You want to know how to get my forgiveness? Give me a life away from the guns. Give our secret baby a father who doesn't have a bounty on his head. Give me the man I treated in that library, not the mafia boss who thinks he can own my heart like a piece of real estate." The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the electricity of their shared past and an uncertain future. Min-ho stepped toward her, his shadow looming large against the floor-to-ceiling windows. For a moment, the obsession in his eyes softened into something raw and agonizingly human. He reached out, his thumb brushing her cheek with a tenderness that hurt more than his coldness. "I can give you anything else, Ava," he whispered, his forehead leaning against hers. "But the world I built is the only one that can keep you safe from the people who want to hurt me." "Then you haven't brought me home," she whispered back. A single tear escaped. "You've just moved the prison." In the suffocating luxury of the penthouse, the sparks of their old flame flickered, but the wall of his crimes stood taller than ever. The fragile peace of the penthouse shattered at 2 a.m., not with a whisper, but with the deafening roar of a security breach. The lights, which usually cast a soft golden glow over Ava's silk robes, flickered and died, plunging the world into a terrifying, sterile darkness. A mole deep within Min-ho's inner circle, someone who had seen the alpha mafia boss soften for a mere black maid, had finally sold his secret. They had leaked her location to the rival syndicate, and now the status contrast between his high-rise sanctuary and the gutter was gone. "Ava, stay down!" Min-ho's voice sliced through the shadows, no longer the voice of a lover, but of a predator in his element. The romantic thriller story reached a terrifying boiling point as the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, designed to showcase his wealth, exploded inward. The sound was like 1,000 diamonds shattering at once. Ava scrambled for cover behind a heavy mahogany desk, her heart leaping into her throat. She wasn't just a woman in a dark romance anymore. She was a target in a war zone. As she huddled low, her hands clutched her belly protectively, realizing with a jolt of pure terror that her hidden pregnancy was the ultimate prize for the men currently storming the hallway. Red laser sights danced across the walls, searching for a kill. Min-ho moved with a lethal, fluid grace that Ava had only ever heard stories about. This was the terrifying reality of his world firsthand, the raw, unfiltered violence that lay beneath designer suits and luxury cars. He stood in the center of the chaos, a dual-wielding god of vengeance, firing with a precision that turned the beautiful penthouse into a slaughterhouse. "They're coming for the secret baby, Ava. Run to the panic room," he roared over the sound of gunfire. But as she moved to flee, a flashbang grenade blinded her, the white light searing into her retinas. For a moment, the romantic thriller felt like a tragedy in the making. She heard the heavy boots of his enemies thumping on the marble, closing in on the woman who held the Mafia's future in her womb. Through the smoke, she saw Min-ho being pressed back by sheer numbers, his face a mask of primal fury. He wasn't fighting for his empire or his status anymore. He was fighting for the second-chance romance he had almost lost. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and copper, a brutal reminder that in his world, love didn't just hurt, it bled. The smoke-filled air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and spent gunpowder. Through the haze, Ava scrambled toward the reinforced door of the panic room, but her foot caught on a stray fragment of marble, sending her stumbling. In that split second, the world slowed down. A lone gunman, emerging from the debris of the shattered terrace, leveled his weapon directly at her. There was no time for Ava to scream, no time to shield the secret baby she carried. Then a shadow moved, faster than thought, more absolute than gravity. Min-ho didn't call out a command or wait for his guards. The alpha mafia boss, a man who had spent his entire life valuing his own survival above all else, threw himself across the space. He didn't just move, he became a human shield. The dull thud of the bullet striking flesh echoed louder than the gunfire for Ava. She watched in horror as his powerful frame jolted, his tailored jacket blossoming with a dark, wet crimson. He collapsed against her, his weight heavy and real, forcing them both to the floor. The status contrast that had always defined them, the king and the black maid, was gone. In this gutter of violence, he was just a man bleeding for the woman he loved. As his men finally neutralized the threat, the silence that followed was deafening. Ava pulled his head into her lap, her hands trembling as she pressed against the wound in his shoulder. "Min-ho, why?" she sobbed, her tears falling onto his pale skin. "You could have stayed back. You could have let the guards." He let out a jagged breath, his fingers curling weakly around her hand. For the first time, the alpha male mask was completely gone, replaced by a raw, staggering vulnerability. His obsessive love, which had once felt like a cage, had finally transformed into a pure, selfless devotion. He wasn't looking at her as a prize to be kept or a legacy to be secured. He was looking at her as his entire world. "The Empire, it means nothing," he rasped, his voice a ghost of its former power. "If you and the baby aren't in it, there is no Empire." In that moment, the Mafia romance reached its ultimate truth. He had chosen her life over his own, proving that he was willing to let his kingdom burn if it meant she could walk through the ashes. This was the ultimate sacrifice, a man giving up his invincibility to protect the heartbeat he had only just learned to love. As the sirens wailed in the distance, Ava held him tight, realizing that the monster she had fled had finally become the man she could truly stay for. The chaos of the night eventually gave way to a quiet, clinical recovery, but the man who emerged from the bandages was not the same mafia boss who had walked into the flower shop. As the dust settled over the ruins of his former life, Lee Min-ho came to a realization that no amount of wealth or power could provide. He could not lose her again. The blood he had shed for Ava and their secret baby had washed away the cold, unyielding layers of his alpha male arrogance. He saw now that his empire was a hollow fortress if it remained a threat to the people he loved. With the same surgical precision he had used to build his syndicate, Min Ho began to dismantle the dangerous parts of his business. He stripped away the illicit trades and the violent territories, laundering his vast resources into legitimate enterprises that didn't require a gun to defend. The status contrast remained. He was still a billionaire of immense influence, but the nature of that power had shifted from fear to foundation. He wasn't just building a company, he was building a sanctuary. Months later, the air in the penthouse was no longer cold and sterile. It smelled of the fresh jasmine and lilies Ava had once grown in her small shop, brought in to fill the sprawling glass halls with life. Ava stood by the window, the morning sun catching the glow of her skin as she held their newborn son. The hidden pregnancy was now a beautiful, living reality, a child who would never know the smell of gunpowder or the sound of the deadbolt sliding shut in fear. Min Ho entered the room, his movements still slightly stiff from the wound that had nearly taken his life. He didn't approach her with the looming, possessive energy of a master. Instead, he stopped several feet away, his dark eyes soft, with an emotional romance drama that words could barely capture. The Mafia romance had been stripped of its darkness, leaving only the raw truth of a man who had finally found his home. Slowly, deliberately, the most powerful man in Seoul lowered himself to one knee. He didn't do it to inspect his heir or to command his household. He knelt before Ava Smith, the woman who had once been his black maid and now was the keeper of his soul. He took her hand in his, the same hand that had once dressed his wounds in a lonely library, and looked up at her not as a boss, but as a man seeking redemption. "I spent my life building walls to keep the world out," he whispered, his voice thick with a newfound humility. "But I realize now that I only ever wanted to be inside yours. I don't want to own you, Ava. I want to earn you. Will you let me be the man you and our son deserve?" In the quiet of the morning, the Mafia boss' secret baby was finally home, and as Ava reached down to pull him up, the forbidden love of their past blossomed into a future of peace. From a hidden secret to a Mafia queen, Ava's journey proves that love can change even the coldest hearts. If you enjoyed this AMBW pregnancy romance, give this video a big thumbs up. Comment "power couple" below if you loved Lee Min-ho's transformation. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more daily stories of obsession and devotion.